Roronoa Zoro was born 21 years ago in the East Blue and was a descendant of the Shimotsuki family from Wano, a legendary bloodline that dates back hundreds of years before the current story to Shimotsuki Ryuma, a man famous for slaying a dragon, who was so legendary he was called the Sword God. But Zoro had no idea about his heritage, and when he was young his father and mother died, so he was orphaned, and lived by himself in Shimotsuki village, which was founded by his ancestors. But Zoro wasn't deterred. For whatever reason, he made it his mission to become stronger, so joined the local dojo to learn to be a swordsman. He learned very quickly, developing his own style by using two swords, which was unusual at the dojo, and through natural talent and hard work, became stronger than everyone, including all the adults, except for the sensei himself and his daughter Kuina. He made it his mission to defeat Kuina, and challenged her many times, every single day. In between training, he went to the edge of the island to see an old man that was always fishing. He told Zoro about a battle cry, Sunachi, that when said would give you courage, but Zoro said it sounded weird, so decided not to use it. But he asked the man if he was a samurai. Everyone in the dojo said he was, but he deflected the question, so Zoro ran away and continued training, but didn't go back to the dojo. The old man asked why, and he said he kept losing to Kuina and needed to train non-stop, so the old man gave him two of his swords. Zoro said he couldn't pay for them, but the man gave them to him for free, and told him that each blade is unique, and that a swordsman is one who tames the sword's wild nature and bends it to their will. The old man gave him pieces of advice like this occasionally, but Zoro was too young and inexperienced to fully understand them, but they stayed in the back of his mind for the future. Zoro continued challenging Kuina, racking up 2,000 fights with her, but wasn't able to win a single one. She mocked him, calling him pathetic and weak, but this only motivated him further, declaring that he would sail the seas and become the greatest swordsman in the world. But Kuina was his first and greatest hurdle to achieving that goal, and after 2,000 matches, Zoro decided that something had to change, and he took drastic measures, challenging Kuina again. But this time, instead of using training swords, he demanded that they use real swords, and she agreed. But within one clash, it was over, and the result didn't change. He was frustrated to his core. No matter what he did, he couldn't beat her. But Kuina told him that she was the one that was frustrated. She said that in a few years, he would be stronger than her, because she was a girl and he was a boy. Her father told her that girls couldn't become master swordsmen, and he was lucky he was a boy. She started crying, saying she wanted to be the greatest swordsman too. But Zoro yelled at her, saying she was crying when she was the one that beat him, that it was his dream to beat her, and that one day he would, and that it would be because he worked hard, not because she got weaker. He was training so hard every day for this goal, and she was gonna make him look bad if she gave up for these reasons. He told her that they had to make a promise to each other, that someday, one of them would become the world's greatest swordsman. She started laughing, calling him an idiot, but she agreed. But the very next day, she died. Zoro screamed out in denial, seeing her dead body. She was his purpose, his goal, and that was ripped away from him after they only just came to understand each other. But now he was more resolved than ever to accomplish his dream. He asked the sensei for Kuina's sword, and he agreed to give it to him. He clutched it with tears in his eyes, and said he would keep the promise for the both of them, and become a swordsman so great that his name would even reach heaven, so Kuina could know he kept his promise. From this point on, he trained like a madman. His hunger and determination reached new heights. He trained like this for the next 11 years, until he turned 19, and thought he was now strong enough to challenge Jakul Mihawk, the current world's strongest swordsman, to take his title and prove to Kuina that he kept his promise. So, he set out to sea in search of Mihawk, but got lost and couldn't even find his way back to his village. So in order to make some money, started bounty hunting, and through easily defeating every pirate he came across, gained the reputation of the pirate hunter, and was feared all across the East Blue. Because of his newfound fame, he was offered a position in an organization called Baroque Works. He said he would only join if they made him the leader, and in response the agent named Mr. Seven attacked him, and he killed him in self-defense. After this, Zoro landed in Shellstown, a marine-controlled area run by Captain Morgan. But while there, he saw someone harassing people with his wolf, and when the wolf attacked a little girl, he defended her. But it turned out that guy was the son of Captain Morgan, and he gave Zoro an ultimatum: be tied to a pole for 1 month or he'd be blacklisted from being a bounty hunter. So Zoro, not wanting to lose his only form of income, agreed. He stood there, tied to a pole in the courtyard, in the sweltering hot sun, with nothing but his willpower and drive to live and become the greatest swordsman keeping him going. After 9 excruciating days of this, someone peeked over a wall to look at him. Zoro smiled and asked him to come untie him. He was sick of this challenge and thought it wasn't worth it anymore, and he would just have to find another way to support himself. Someone else popped out and said not to do it, that Zoro would kill them if he was untied. But the other one replied that he couldn't kill them, he wouldn't let him, and this shocked Zoro. Ever since he set out to sea, and even before that, since Kuina's death, he was always the strongest. He always beat his competition easily, and he truly believed he was the strongest swordsman in the world. But this man, knowing full well who he was, didn't fear him at all, and even said he could beat him with full confidence. Before Zoro could think more about this, the little girl he saved before came running up to him. He tried to threaten her so she would get away from danger, but she ignored him and offered him some rice balls she'd made to thank him for saving her. He lied and said he wasn't hungry, then shouted at her, desperate to get her away from the marine base. But just what he feared happened. The guy from earlier, lLffy, returned and snatched a rice ball from the girl and took a bite, but spat it out, hating the taste. He threw the rice balls on the ground and started stomping on them, and the girl started crying, seeing her hard work being destroyed. This annoyed lLffy, and he ordered his guard to throw her over the wall without mercy. He then confirmed to Zoro that the deal was still on, saying he wouldn't break his word. But after he left, the guy from earlier came up to him, Monkey D. Luffy. He told Zoro he needed members for his pirate crew, and Zoro laughed at the idea, but he replied that being a pirate was his dream. But Zoro still poked fun at him and said he had his own plans, and reinvigorated, decided that he would stay the full month, and after that would be free to pursue his dreams, but had one request. He asked Luffy to pick up the rice balls smudged on the floor and feed them to him, and even though they tasted awful, he ate every last bit and told Luffy to tell the girl that they were delicious. After some time, Luffy returned, and Zoro again said he wouldn't join his crew, but Luffy said he'd untie him if he did, but Zoro didn't budge. He said he wouldn't become a pirate, but Luffy said that he was a bounty hunter that everyone called a demon, but Zoro replied that he didn't care what anyone thought, and would go for his dreams and follow his own code. Luffy paused for a while, but then said he made up his mind Zoro would join his crew, and this pissed him off on a whole new level. But Luffy ignored him, and asked where his swords were, and he said that lLffy took them. So Luffy got an idea. He'd steal them, and then Zoro would have no choice but to join his crew to get them back, and Luffy promptly ran off to do just that despite Zoro's protests. But Zoro didn't expect much. He was heading for Captain Morgan's fortress as just one pirate, so he definitely didn't stand a chance. The other boy from earlier, Kobe, then came to free Zoro, and told him that Luffy's dream was to be the king of the pirates, which shocked Zoro to his core. But before Kobe could free him, he was shot from the top of the fortress. He survived, so Zoro told him to leave, but Kobe revealed that lLffy had lied to him. He planned to have him executed, and never intended to actually set him free, and that when Luffy heard about this, he punched lLffy, risking his own life. Zoro was stunned for a number of reasons, but before Zoro could really consider this, they were surrounded by marines, and confronted by Captain Morgan himself. He ordered his soldiers to take aim, and as Zoro looked down the barrels of the guns pointed at him, he said to himself that he couldn't die yet, remembering his promise to Kuina. But right then, Luffy got in the way of the bullets, saving his life, but all the bullets bounced right off him. He was a lLffy user that had the gum fruit. Zoro asked just what he was, and he responded that he was the man that would become the king of the pirates. He showed Zoro that he kept his word and had gotten his swords back, but then said that he'd be labeled a traitor to the Marines if he joined them and fought back against them now. But Zoro said he wasn't willing to let himself be killed by them without a fight, so Luffy had himself a new pirate. Luffy started untying him, but the Marines charged forward to prevent this. They got closer and closer, but Luffy wasn't having success as Zoro was screaming at him at the top of his lungs, until finally he got one of his arms free and handed him his swords, and in one swift movement, Zoro cut himself free and blocked all the attacks of the group of Marines that charged him. He said the first one who moved would die, then turned to Luffy, saying he had a mission to fulfill. He was gonna be the world's greatest swordsman, and if Luffy made him abandon his dream for any reason, he wouldn't forgive him. Luffy smiled and said anything less than the greatest swordsman would make the king of the pirates look bad. Luffy was the first man Zoro ever met that had greater ambitions than him, and even though he said he only joined Luffy out of necessity, Luffy truly was the only person he would ever follow, someone like-minded, the first person since Kuina that didn't scoff at his dreams and was aiming for something great, just like him. Zoro didn't have a problem with being a pirate, he only hunted them so he could make a living. All this time, he worked on his own to achieve his dreams, but now he didn't mind being in a group if it meant they could support each other's goals and work together to achieve them. And it turned out, him and Luffy were a pretty natural team. They took down all the Marines until lLffy pointed a gun at Kobe and threatened to shoot, but Luffy geared up to attack him, even while Morgan was right behind him, ready to strike him with his axe hand. But even after being a team for a mere few minutes, he fully trusted Zoro to have his back, and he didn't let him down, saving Luffy and knocking out Morgan with one slash, and calling Luffy his captain. Zoro fully respected Luffy's strength, seeing it firsthand. He could back up everything he was saying, a sharp contrast to Morgan, who talked a big game but didn't have the strength to show for it. So, they'd done it. They got through their first challenge together as crewmates, and it was time to celebrate. The mother of the little girl Zoro saved owned a restaurant and let them eat for free, with Zoro happily eating his fill after nearly starving to death. But Zoro quickly got down to business, asking Luffy what was next, and he said that they were headed for the Grand Line, and Zoro thought as much. He didn't know much about the One Piece, but he at least knew that you need to be in the Grand Line to find it. The Marines then had to ask them to leave, as they were pirates now, and they were happy to, setting out to sea to achieve their outlandish, ridiculous dreams that only the two of them believed in. They moved on to Orange Town, where they fought the pirate captain Buggy. Zoro rushed headfirst into fighting him, and he sliced him apart with the first attack. Zoro said that was almost disappointing, but when he had his guard down, he was stabbed in the back. Buggy was a Del Fruit user, with the Chop Chop Fruit, the perfect counter to Zoro, someone immune to swords. This was Zoro's first opponent since Kuina to give him a challenge, and was a wake-up call. He trained so hard, learned so much, he thought the only man who would be a challenge to him was Mihawk, so underestimated his opponents. It worked out for him before, but this time he paid for it, and also learned the lesson to expect the unexpected in a world like this, full of a vast array of powers that would only get more unexpected as they progressed to the Grand Line. Luffy then told Zoro to run, and he complied, understanding Luffy's plan, but Buggy went to attack him, but he blocked everything and turned Buggy's own cannon at him and fired. He ran back to Luffy, who was trapped in a cage, and asked the woman with him who she was, and Luffy said that she was their new navigator, Nami. Zoro didn't really care. He trusted Luffy's judgment to recruit good members, and returned his focus to rescuing him. He picked up the metal and stone cage. Blood poured out of his open wound, and Luffy said his guts would fall out, but he didn't care, saying he'd put them back in if he had to, and started running, carrying his captain on his back, despite the pain, and they were able to get away. Luffy was eventually able to break free, and Zoro had to fight another member of Buggy's crew, a swordsman named Kabaji, so Zoro knew he couldn't let his guard down this time. He was still struggling from his injury though, and Luffy offered to fight him, but Kabaji took the chance to distract him and kick him right in his wound. Zoro screamed out in pain, and Kabaji didn't let up, attacking him again, but Zoro blocked, and he kicked him in the same spot again. Zoro was feeling the worst pain of his life, writhing on the floor, but when Kabaji went in for the killing blow, Zoro got up and knocked him back. Then, he sliced the wound himself. He said his goal was to be the greatest swordsman, so he didn't care if he had to fight with a handicap. Zoro here is punishing himself. He hasn't forgiven himself for letting his guard down against Buggy, and rather than not admitting to his mistakes, he does the opposite. He makes the consequences of his mistake even worse to make sure he learns from it, and as an added effect gives himself the hardest fight of his life to properly prepare for Mihawk. He doubled down, saying he could never lose even once to someone who called himself a swordsman. If he did, he would be dishonoring Kuina's memory, and wasting his years of hard work. Kabaji came at him with his most ferocious techniques, and Buggy assisted him, shooting his hand out to hold Zoro down, but Luffy saved him, just as Zoro had done for him against Captain Morgan. Zoro gave a chuckle, but then got serious, saying he was tired of Kabaji's tricks, thinking he was making a mockery of swordsmanship, and probably finished him off with his technique that he'd perfected for years to prove his superiority. Then, with his fight done, collapsed, leaving the rest to his captain, since he wouldn't have joined him if he didn't have complete faith in him. They later landed in Sierra Village, where they met a guy called Usopp, and through some hurdles they defeated Captain Kuro and the Black Cat Pirates, and also gained a proper ship, the Going Merry. They were preparing to leave, and Usopp started saying he'd see them around and would go out to sea himself, but throughout their short adventure together, they really bonded as a team, and it felt like it went without saying that he was part of the crew now, so Zoro basically told him to stop yapping and get on board, and so they gained another member. They sailed off and soon met up with Johnny and Yosaku, two bounty hunter friends that Zoro met a while back, and they gave the crew the idea to head to a sea restaurant, Baratie. There, they met a chef named Sanji. But soon, the restaurant was attacked by a pirate named Don Krieg. He started wreaking havoc, but everything was interrupted when Krieg's ship was cut in half, and Zoro's goal appeared in front of his eyes, Dracul Mihawk. He was stunned to see him in the flesh, all the years of build-up, endless training, all while picturing this very moment. But Zoro was ready. He calmly walked up and asked him if he truly did split that gigantic ship in half, and he said of course. Zoro started sweating, realizing his strength was just as advertised, but his confidence didn't fade. He put on his bandana and told Mihawk he came to sea to find him, and challenged him to a duel. But Mihawk was insulted by the request, calling him pathetic, saying they didn't need to cross blades for him to know he was far above him, and deep down, Zoro did. But he was still confident, and he said that his mindset didn't come from ignorance like Mihawk suggested, but from ambition, and a promise to a friend. But Mihawk wasn't impressed, and took out the smallest knife he had, saying he wasn't the type to hunt rabbits with a cannon. Zoro was angry that Mihawk was taking him lightly, and rushed forward to prove himself. He attacked with his signature technique, Onigiri, which has never failed to defeat every single previous opponent with one blow, but Mihawk blocked it with perfect technique, using only the very tip of his knife to stop all of Zoro's momentum. Zoro was stunned. No one had ever countered this technique before, let alone like this, in the most flawless way possible. Zoro couldn't believe what was happening. He refused to accept that they were this far apart. He started doubting himself and swung at Mihawk wildly, but was tossed back like a ragdoll. He charged forward again, but Mihawk dodged and countered like it was as easy to him as breathing. Zoro's mind was in chaos, thinking there was no way he came this far to lose. To break his promise, he had to win. There was no other option, and Mihawk called out his desperation, asking why he tried so hard when he was so weak, and batted him away once again. Zoro prepared another one of his signature moves and went in again, thinking this time of his promise to Luffy, but Mihawk found an opening and stabbed him in the chest. He stood there, refusing to retreat. Mihawk was puzzled, and Zoro told him the reason was that he felt that if he took even one step back, his promise, ambition, and everything he cared about would be shattered, and his dreams would be lost forever. And Mihawk bluntly told him that was what defeat was, so Zoro said he couldn't retreat. He would rather die than be defeated. Mihawk took the knife out and asked for his name. He told him, and Mihawk said he'd remember it, and took out his legendary supreme blade, Yoru, saying he would do him the honor of killing him with it, rather than dishonoring him with a death by his knife. This time Mihawk charged, and Zoro prepared his final secret technique, the 3000 Whirls, and they clashed. But Mihawk utterly defeated him, slicing his two swords he got from the old man in his village apart. He saw a glimpse of the peak of this world, and was hit with the cold hard reality that all his training and preparation over 11 entire years was worthless in the face of his goal. He stood up and opened his defenses. Mihawk was shocked and asked what he was doing, and he responded that wounds on the back were a swordsman's greatest shame. Mihawk smiled, utterly impressed, and delivered his final blow. Zoro fell into the ocean with his chest sliced open, but Mihawk purposely left him alive. Johnny and Yosaku dragged him back above water, and Mihawk had a message for him. He said it was too soon for him to die. He had to discover himself, see the world, and grow strong. However long it may take, he would wait for him at the top. Zoro was fading in and out of consciousness, but he used the last of his strength to point his sword to the heavens, and promised Luffy, and Kuina as well, that he would never lose again. From that point until the day he beat Mihawk, he would never lose again. Zoro allowed his life to be in Mihawk's hands. If he was anyone different or even in a different mood, Zoro's dreams could have ended right there. This was his ultimate wake-up call. Everything he'd been doing wasn't working, and he had to change. He was truly humbled, being a big fish in a small pond. Constantly being told he was a demon and feared wherever he went gave him false confidence, and Mihawk rightfully showed him that. This defeat was the best thing that could have happened to Zoro. If he went into the Grand Line believing his own hype, he would have met a quick end, and he knew that now. He experienced firsthand what was possible, so being able to visualize that, he could get stronger and evolve faster than ever before. Zoro was bandaged up and regained consciousness, but he was still in critical condition. However, he had no time to recover, since it turned out that Nami had stolen their ship and taken it to Arlong Park, the residence of the most dangerous pirate in the East Blue. But Zoro didn't care. He wanted to bust right into Arlong Park, even in his condition. So Usopp and Johnny tied him to the ship while they formed a plan. But when some fishmen spotted them, they jumped overboard, with Zoro unable to free himself, and he was captured. He was brought before Arlong himself, but was pissed off, demanding to know where Nami was so they could get off that island and carry on with their journey, now that his goal was in clearer focus than ever before. But that was when Nami appeared, and Zoro was shocked to learn that she was actually a part of Arlong's crew. He asked if this was the real her, and she said it was, but after Arlong mentioned the death of her parent, her face changed, and Zoro suspected she was lying, so put her to the test, and jumped into the ocean while tied up, resigning himself to drown, predicting that Nami would save him. And just as he thought, she did. This shows Zoro's commitment to the crew. His passion for his dreams was greater than it had ever been, but he risked it all to get the crew back together. He was thrown in jail, but Nami came to free him when Arlong was away. But he took the chance to instead demolish Arlong's entire crew and sit on his throne, saying he could leave, but he promised Luffy to get Nami back, and would stop at nothing to fulfill that promise. Later, the crew learned that Nami only joined Arlong to protect her village, and so all that was left to do was defeat Arlong and his crew, and Nami and her village would be safe. Zoro was once again matched up with a swordsman, this time the 6 sword-wielding Hachi. He got Johnny and Yosaku's swords and ducked through the guards of the 6 swords to slice Hachi, and this angered him, and he said that his 3 swords was no match for 6, but Zoro replied that his 3 swords carried much more weight than his, and even while on the brink of death, proved it, defeating him by cutting through his swords and dealing a finishing blow. Later on, he confronted Arlong while Sanji went to rescue Luffy, but in his current state, couldn't fight anymore, and Arlong picked him up by the neck. He ripped off his bandages, and the true extent of his horrifying injuries were revealed, and even Arlong, the East Blue's strongest, wondered how Zoro was even alive after taking this much damage, a testament to Mihawk's belief in Zoro, dealing a blow like this to him to test if he could come through it alive. But his sacrifice in confronting Arlong in this state paid off, and Luffy was rescued, trading places with Zoro, which tested his durability once again. But, in the end, Luffy beat Arlong, just as Zoro expected. And with that, they completed their journey in the East Blue, and it was time for the big leagues. But before then, they had to get through Logtown, the final island in the East Blue. And while there, Zoro decided he might as well buy some swords since he'd need some new ones soon if he planned to do well in the Grand Line. As he was looking around, he saw a lady being threatened and was about to step in to help, but she easily sliced through her attackers, but slipped and fell in front of Zoro. He picked up her glasses for her, but as he looked at her face, his mind got scrambled. She was the spitting image of Kuina, but he tried not to think about it and walked into a sword shop. He told the owner his budget, and he told him he could pick 2 swords from a barrel, but the girl from earlier came in, and identified one of them as a legendary blade, but the shop owner said it was cursed, so Zoro decided to put that curse to the test. It was his luck versus the sword's curse. This was the kind of drastic measure he needed after the Mihawk fight. It was the only way to make the rapid improvements he needed to even get close to Mihawk's level, and even if the curse prevailed, it would mean he just wasn't meant to be the greatest swordsman. So threw the sword in the air and stuck his arm out. Either it would slice it clean off, or he would gain a new legendary sword to improve his strength. And his luck beat out the sword's curse, so he took it. And the shop owner was so impressed that he gave him the best sword in his shop, finally feeling whole again with 3 swords. He met back up with the crew, and they set out for the Grand Line. They all made a declaration of their goals, and now, it was finally time to pursue them for real. They landed on Whiskey Peak, where they were met with a warm welcome for the locals. Zoro happily drank his fill, and the rest of the crew did the same, letting their guards down. But in actuality, the entire town was filled with bounty hunters. Their tactic was to welcome new pirates entering the Grand Line, then turn them into the Marines to claim their bounty. But Zoro didn't fall for it, saying a true swordsman never drinks himself into a stupor. He was surrounded by 100 bounty hunters, and he took them all on, using this chance to test out his new swords. On that night, he took down 100 expert bounty hunters, and this would be the beginning of his legendary legacy. They then sailed off and ended up in Alabasta, where they were embroiled in a civil war. The perpetrators were Baroque Works, the group that approached Zoro a while back. He easily dealt with Mr. 7 back then, but now it was up to him to take down Mr. 1. And when he attacked him, his body was immune to his strikes. He again encountered a Devil Fruit user that couldn't be damaged by him, this time because Mr. 1 ate the Dice fruit, turning his entire body into a sword. His body was made out of steel, and Zoro learned his lesson to not underestimate him. Zoro started using all of his signature moves, but as you might expect, nothing even scratched Mr. 1. Zoro said that was too bad. He couldn't cut steel yet, so he couldn't beat him. But because of this, he felt sorry for Mr. 1. He was waiting to be driven into a corner like this, so he could surpass his current strength. So when he defeated him, it would mean he would be able to cut through steel. Mr. 1 said that no swordsman had ever put a scratch on him, but Zoro replied that he never met a swordsman like him before, and they clashed once again. Mr. 1 employed his fruit to its fullest extent, using every part of his body as a sword, and not only that, but customizing it further, and making all different types of weapons, and with overwhelming pressure, he launched Zoro backwards into a building. The rubble collapsed on him, which would crush any ordinary man to death, but Zoro refused to die. He thought to himself that he reached the brink of death countless times, so what was missing? And then, he remembered a lesson his sensei taught him. Back then, Zoro said he heard there were people who could cut through steel, and his sensei said that was true, and demonstrated by throwing a piece of paper in the air, swinging his sword, and not cutting through it. Zoro was confused, but the lesson was that there were swordsmen who were able to not cut through anything, and those were the same ones who could cut through steel. In other words, control was the answer. Having such control of your sword and your own power to be able to swing at a piece of paper and not cut through it if you choose, was what could allow you to have the control to cut through even steel. And even though Zoro didn't understand the lesson back then, he did now. He lifted the building he was buried under and threw it at Mr. 1, ready to put his sensei's teachings into practice. He went in again, but things weren't clicking. He still couldn't do any damage. Mr. One used more strange techniques and was able to catch Zoro off guard and slice him. He threw Zoro back once again, and Zoro told himself to not show his back. He couldn't allow himself to be wounded there by anyone, so he turned, and Mr. One delivered a lethal slash. Rubble again rained down on Zoro, but this time he wasn't hit by any of it. Mr. One asked how he dodged it, but he said he didn't. He just knew where the stones wouldn't fall. He flipped the stone over, knowing exactly where his sword was buried. His senses were heightened more than ever before. He was one with his surroundings, feeling like everything around him was alive, and he thought this was it, the power to cut steel. But his body was near death. He was barely conscious. He had just enough energy for one final attack. He raised the sword, and Mr. One asked if he thought he could defend himself with just one sword, and he replied that he wouldn't defend himself. He would go purely on offense. Either his attack would hit Mr. One first and be powerful enough to not only pierce his skin, but take him down as well, or Zoro would die. He got into his stance, and while hearing the voices of everything around him with more clarity than ever before, everything fell into place. He thanked Mr. One, because now he discovered he had the power to cut through steel, and was one step closer to his dreams. They left Alabasta, and through their journey discovered a map of a sky island named Skypiea. Luffy wanted to go there, so they went to Jai to learn more information about it. They walked into a bar, and a guy named Bellamy came up to Luffy. He acted nice at first, offering him a drink, but Zoro saw what Bellamy's plan was, and pulled out his sword. Bellamy slammed Luffy through the table, but at the same moment, Zoro put his sword to Bellamy's neck. He wouldn't let anyone disrespect and harm the man he pledged himself to. Zoro's word was ironclad, and he would fight anyone for his captain. But Luffy asked him to do the opposite, and he obeyed completely. Zoro isn't just a hothead looking for fights. He'll do what's best for his captain, whether it's defending him or letting himself get hit, because his pride means nothing in the face of his loyalty. But in the end, their mockery meant nothing, and they did make it to Skypiea, just as Luffy said they would. Nothing huge in terms of Zoro's character happened here, except for this moment of course. And after saving the people of Skypiea from the tyranny of Enel, they headed back down to the Blue Sea. They landed on Longring Longland, where they encountered Admiral Aokiji. Zoro blocked his attack, saving Robin, but in the process got his arm frozen. Aokiji was 1/3 of one of the 3 great powers in the world. Mihawk coincidentally was part of another one of the 3 powers, being a warlord, and this again showed Zoro his level compared to the very strongest in the world, and showed him how much work he still had to do. Luffy ended up convincing Aokiji to let them off, and they sailed off to Water 7 to find themselves a shipwright to repair the Going Merry, which had taken a lot of damage throughout their journey. Zoro stayed on the ship, and soon a shipwright named Kaku came over to look at the Merry, but after a while he told Zoro that it was impossible to repair, and they'd have to get another ship. Zoro was saddened by this. He, like the rest of the crew, had gotten attached to the Merry, but when they all got back together, Luffy made the tough choice to leave the Merry behind, as it was unsafe to sail on her any longer. But this brought out pure rage in Usopp. He was the most attached to the Merry for many reasons, and him and Luffy got into a big argument that culminated in Usopp saying he would leave the crew. Zoro didn't say anything, and just thought back on the moment he first asked Usopp to join them. Usopp left, and then challenged Luffy to a duel for the ownership of the Merry. Zoro watched on with a blank expression on his face, waiting for the result, and in the end, as everyone expected, Luffy came out as the winner. Luffy started shaking, with tears welling up in his eyes, and Zoro told him that was the burden of being the captain. He couldn't doubt himself. If he became unsure, who else could they have faith in? Zoro took his position as vice captain very seriously, and would step up and give advice and support to his captain to keep him on the right track, and this wouldn't be the last instance of that. Later, it turned out that Kaku and the other shipwrights were members of a government organization named CP9, and they had recruited Robin to their cause. Luffy refused to believe Robin joined them, but she told Sanji and Chopper that she did. Zoro put his foot down and laid out the situation, saying she started off as their enemy, and they let her on their ship, so it was time to really consider if she was an enemy or friend. Zoro started going over the situation bluntly, talking about the worst case scenarios, preparing the crew as a vice captain should, ultimately saying that whatever move Robin and CP9 would make, they would make it that night, and Luffy said they would be there. They confronted CP9, and Robin said she would leave, but Luffy yelled out, telling her he wouldn't let her leave like this. He charged headfirst after her, but the CP9 agents were immovable. They went on the offensive, kicking Luffy, but it wasn't an ordinary kick. As a swordsman, Zoro recognized it as a slash, and told the rest of the crew to get down. Then, he charged directly for Kaku, the swordsman of the group, and clashed blades with him. Zoro held him off, telling Luffy to get Robin, but Kaku took advantage of him, taking his attention away, and stabbed him right in the chest. Zoro collapsed while Luffy was held back, and they were unable to stop Robin from leaving. The main agent Robolucci then grabbed Luffy and threw him out of the building, so Zoro went in to attack him, but he kicked him out of the building as well. It was an utter defeat for the entire crew, but there was one silver lining. They later discovered that Robin didn't actually betray them. She made a deal with CP9 that she would turn herself in exchange for them allowing the Strawhats to leave Water 7 peacefully. She sacrificed herself for them, and that was all Zoro needed to hear to get him fully on board the cause to rescue her. But she was on a train, being taken to the Judgment Island, Eni's lobby, but through determination and a little bit of luck, they were able to board another train, and were catching up with Robin fast. On the way, they encountered a part of the original train stranded on the tracks. They didn't know how it got disconnected, but Luffy simply ordered Zoro to cut through it, and he obeyed his captain. He then fought a marine captain named T-Bone. They both had mutual respect, but Zoro did what had to be done for them to progress further. They soon arrived at Eni's lobby, and Zoro was once again face to face with Kaku. He was pushed to the brink because of multiple inconveniences, and Kaku being a genuinely strong opponent, being the number 2 in CP9, and having just eaten a powerful devil fruit, no matter how goofy he might have seemed. They went back and forth, with Zoro gradually ramping up, until he decided to unveil his ultimate technique, the 9-sword style Ashura. This move was so powerful he was able to project 3 of himself, along with 9 swords as a result, and it wasn't just an illusion, as the power boost he got from it very much felt to Kaku like he was suddenly fighting 3 Zoros, and after that he made quick work of him. This fight was the farthest Zoro had been pushed in a long time, having to utilize a secret technique, which we don't know exactly when he created. He met back up with Sanji, and said they had to hurry to Robin. She sacrificed herself for them, and Zoro's honor and loyalty wouldn't allow him to fail in rescuing her, and along with help from the rest of the crew, they did. And with Luffy beating Robolucci, it was time for them to leave, but they had no way off the island as they were surrounded by Navy warships. But just then, Usopp told them to jump off into the ocean, and although Zoro didn't understand his plan, he trusted them, and when they did jump off, they landed into the Going Merry. The Merry had come to save them, but unfortunately, the situation with the Merry hadn't changed. This last-ditch effort to rescue them was the final thing it could muster, and it couldn't sail any further, so they had to say goodbye. And although Zoro didn't have the same connection to the Merry as the rest of the Straw Hats, he still stood there, stoic, paying his respects to their crewmate. Speaking of crewmates, there was the situation of Usopp. Everyone on the crew, including Zoro, wanted him back, but as they rushed to welcome him with open arms, Zoro stopped them. He wouldn't let them get him back that easily. He told Luffy he better not let him back on unless he apologized. The crew got angry at him, but he told them to shut up. He carried on, saying it didn't matter who was right or wrong when Luffy and Usopp argued, but the fact was that when 2 men decide to have a duel, the winner is the only thing that matters, and Usopp lost, on his own terms, and left the crew as a result. He said that Luffy might be an idiot, but he was still the captain, and they were better off without a crewmate who couldn't respect their captain when things got tough. Any crew that allowed that to happen was destined to fail. He turned to Luffy, saying he didn't care how much he messed around usually, but he was his captain, and if he didn't act like it at a time like this, Zoro would be the next one to leave. The crew thought he was just complicating things, but Zoro replied that he was all for Usopp coming back, but if he didn't address and apologize for what he did, and try to sweep it under the rug, Zoro wouldn't forgive him, and they would leave Usopp behind on that island. They tried to say that Zoro could tell Usopp all this after they let him back on board, but this pushed Zoro over the edge, shouting, asking them if him leaving meant nothing to them. Zoro takes his position as vice captain very seriously, even if he might not always look like it. He's gone to hell and back to rescue his crewmates and keep the crew together, so he wouldn't stand for his crewmates not taking the sanctity of their crew as seriously as he did, feeling they could leave and join whenever they wanted, accept each other back on a whim. Zoro was usually relaxed, but he was absolutely immovable on the bare minimums. They weren't playing pirates here. When he pledged himself to Luffy, he knew the life he was getting into, and he was willing to risk it all for his crewmates, and he refused to be part of a crew that didn't have the same mindset. And luckily, they all ended up agreeing, seeing how right he was. They prepared to set sail, and Usopp at first did what Zoro predicted, acting like the duel and his departure never happened, or that it was a joke, or some other lie or excuse. But the crew stood firm, refusing to let him back on if he didn't own up to his mistakes. Usopp fell to his knees, seeing his beloved crew sail off without him, and he screamed out that he was sorry. He was sorry for being stubborn, for saying he was quitting, and begged them to let him take it back. He yelled out to please let him join them again, and Luffy stretched out his arm and welcomed him back. Zoro smiled. That was all he wanted, all of them to be on the same page, and now that they were ready to move on with their journey. But there was still a small problem. Zoro left the island with one less sword, since the one he'd gotten from the salesman back in Logtown was destroyed during their battle to escape. So once again, he was down to 2 swords and didn't feel quite right. He could have gotten another random one, but Zoro would rather be a sword down than have to settle for one below his level. So he figured he'd find a suitable one along the way, and that brings us to Thriller Bark. He encountered his ancestor, Shimotsuki Ryuma, or at least his reanimated corpse, but even still, he had all the skill and finesse he had while still alive, but luckily he was severely handicapped by only having access to Brook's techniques. At the same time though, Zoro was handicapped as well by only having access to 2 swords, so this fight would be quite even. Zoro was fighting for multiple things: the honor of his ancestor and the greatest swordsman by putting him to rest in peace instead of him having to live on as a zombie servant for Moria, and he was also fighting for his legendary blade Shisui. Zoro was astonished by his technique and speed. This corpse was able to block his moves with ease. They were fighting a perfectly even match, but Zoro could feel himself and even his swords wearing down, saying they could break if the fight went on much longer. But Ryuma was feeling the strain as well, so they both decided to put their all into one final clash, and put it all on the line, and Zoro was able to connect first. As Ryuma was fading away, he said that his legendary blade would surely be satisfied with Zoro as its new master, and Zoro caught it, telling Ryuma he wished he could have seen him in his prime. As a swordsman, this fight, even if it was against a lesser version of Ryuma, must have felt like a rite of passage, an incredibly high honor for Zoro, and as his reward, he got one of the finest swords in the world, both in reputation and in quality. They went on to fight Gecko Moria, and Luffy was able to defeat him, but the crew was completely exhausted, having been pushed to the edge. But at that moment, they were confronted by yet another warlord, Bartholomew Kuma. With Luffy being unconscious after his fight, Zoro offered to take on Kuma himself, and after taking down some others that tried to fight him, Kuma agreed. Usopp yelled out that Zoro was too injured to fight, but he responded that at times like this, you have to step up. Making excuses wouldn't do anything, and if he died there, he wasn't worth much to begin with. And with that, he drew his swords and attacked Kuma. But it did nothing, and Kuma fired back. Zoro barely moved out of the way, but even so, just the shockwave of the attack made his breathing ragged. He tried to attack again, and he realized that Kuma had the ability to deflect any attack, so it was useless. The battle was going downhill fast for Zoro, so the crew jumped in to help, but they were just as ineffective as him. So Kuma gave them an offer. He would spare their lives if they gave him Luffy's head, but without even having to think about it, they screamed that they never would, and Kuma unleashed his biggest attack yet. Everyone was knocked unconscious, so Kuma dug through the rubble and found Luffy, but as he went to pick him up, Zoro slashed him, revealing he was part cybernetic. Zoro reiterated Kuma's offer to take the head of Luffy in exchange for the rest of them to leave alive, then offered his own head instead. He said that one day, he would have become the world's greatest swordsman without a doubt, so his life was valuable. Kuma was shocked. Zoro had that much ambition and confidence, but was willing to end his journey there for the sake of Luffy. And Zoro replied that was the only way to save his crew. What good was his ambition if he couldn't even save the life of his own captain? And Luffy was the man that would become the king of the pirates. But right then, Sanji emerged, saying he was right about Luffy, but he had his dream as well. So he offered his life instead. But Zoro knocked him out, refusing to put this burden on any of his other crewmates. It would be shameful to him if he as the vice captain allowed one of his crewmates to sacrifice himself while the captain was unconscious. It had to be him. And Kuma accepted his offer, but with one catch. In his words, he'd give him a glimpse of hell. He extracted all the pain and suffering from Luffy's body that he gained throughout his entire life-threatening battle with Moria, and Zoro would have to take on the suffering if he truly wanted to take Luffy's place. He was near death himself, so taking out the injuries of someone else who was near death would be too much for him, so Kuma said he would die, and gave him just a fraction of the pain to see for himself. As Zoro took it in, he screamed at the top of his lungs, coughing up blood and collapsing after only feeling the tiniest bit of the pain that was to come. But he stood up, saying all he asked was to change location, so his crew wouldn't see what would come next. He stood there, in front of the sum of all of his captain's suffering, and without hesitation, jumped headfirst into it. As promised, Kuma left the island. Zoro had protected his crew. As they woke up one by one, Sanji went looking for Zoro, and found him, standing with his arms crossed, in a pool of his own blood. Sanji was mortified, and shouted, asking him how he was alive, where did Kuma go, what happened? But Zoro had one simple response.
何もなかった。
Luffy had no clue what Zoro had done, and he chose to keep it that way. Zoro wasn't loyal for recognition or praise. He was loyal because that was the pledge he made to himself, and he wouldn't be able to sleep at night if he didn't adhere to his own promises. So it didn't matter if no one else knew what he had to do to prove his loyalty to himself. They sailed off, heading for the Sabayoti archipelago. Their goal was to head into the New World, the second half of the Grand Line, where Zoro would face the toughest swordsman yet. But on Sabayoti, they would find out they weren't yet ready. Zoro yet again came face to face with Kuma, and he just asked, if he were to take a trip, where would he want to go? Then, with one swipe, he made Zoro disappear. Kuma had the ability to send people across the world by making them soar through the sky, and in Zoro's case, he was sent to the Gloom Island on the Grand Line. He was rendered unconscious from all his injuries and was found by Perona, one of Moria's henchmen who was also sent here by Kuma. She bandaged him up and took him to a nearby castle. He woke up and after remembering what happened, screamed in anger that he wasn't able to do anything to help his captain and crew and felt completely powerless. When he got his strength up, he started walking around the island and encountered sword-wielding monkeys. He had no reason to fight in his current state, so returned to the castle, and after a while, someone arrived. Mihawk. It turned out he lived on this island, and he came with news. In just a short amount of time, Zoro was on the island unconscious. His captain had fought through countless obstacles, let alone an entire war, all to save his brother, who in the end died anyway. Zoro was mortified. He was not only separated from his crew in a time of peril, he wasn't there for his captain at his absolute lowest moment. He needed to get off the island and back to Luffy. Mihawk warned him about the danger of the monkeys, but he refused to listen, so Mihawk gave him a boat. He fought through countless monkeys, with the boat being destroyed in the process. After a while, Mihawk came out and told him the monkeys were called human drills, and adapted to the warring humans they saw on the island in the past, so were immensely powerful. Mihawk asked him to come back to his castle, but Zoro said he needed to go out to sea, and continued fighting, even while near death from his injuries. After some time, he did return to the castle. He went before Mihawk and bowed his head to the ground, submitting himself to the man he trained every day of his life to beat, and asked him to be his teacher. Mihawk was disgusted. This wasn't the same man filled with pride that he first met. He told him to leave, and that he was humiliating himself, but Zoro just replied that he wanted to get stronger. Mihawk was disappointed. Zoro lost to the monkeys and wasn't able to go out to sea, so he came here groveling to him. He had nothing to teach a man who couldn't keep his word. But he was wrong about Zoro. He told Mihawk that he did beat the monkeys, which shocked him. Zoro had no reason to submit himself, so he didn't understand why he was begging his greatest enemy to teach him. But Zoro responded that it was all to surpass him. Mihawk burst out in laughter at the idea he wanted him to teach him what he knew so he could one day use those skills to kill him, and Mihawk now understood. Zoro truly was the same man he met before, but now there was something he valued more than his pride. So, understanding his mistake, he agreed to teach Zoro, admiring his ambition. Zoro was willing to cast aside his own pride in order to get stronger as fast as possible, to be able to protect his crew and captain in the future. No matter how high a standard he put on others, it was nothing compared to the pressure he put on himself. He was willing to do the unthinkable, bow down to his enemy, if it meant he could get stronger for his captain. And that was exactly the plan. Luffy sent the entire crew a message that they would meet back up in 2 years, and to use that time to get stronger. Zoro understood that they weren't at the level of the New World, and he had a long way to go, but training with Mihawk would fast track him more than anything else. His short fight with him taught Zoro more than 11 years of training beforehand did, so 2 entire years would be life-changing. So Zoro let Perona treat his injuries, and when he healed up, began his training with his future rival. Mihawk was a pretty hands-off instructor, just telling him the basics of hockey and letting him figure out the rest, saying he wasn't allowed any alcohol until he could turn his blaze black with arm and hockey. Evidently, with the extra motivation he did, and advanced immensely during these 2 years. Not many details are known, but he used his time and the privilege of Mihawk's knowledge to advance further than he ever would have otherwise. When the time was almost up, Perona was the one to take him back to Sabayoti, and he actually arrived before any of the other Strawhats, a feat that wouldn't have been possible without Perona, no doubt. After she left, he got bored and wandered around, coming across a fisherman. He told him he wanted to go fishing, and the man told him to get on his boat. But Zoro got on a pirate ship by mistake, and got comfortable, falling asleep. But before he woke up, the ship went underwater towards Fishman Island. He was woken up by this, and immediately sliced his ship in half, causing it to go back to the surface. After this ordeal, he met up with the rest of the crew, and they went down to Fishman Island. He got to show off his new strength, and pulled off the incredible feat of easily defeating a fishman while underwater, and later defeating the greatest swordsman on the island, again with ease. On the next island, Punk Hazard, Zoro came up against Monet. She thought he wouldn't attack her since she was a woman, but he compared himself to a wild beast, saying you could never guarantee he wouldn't attack. He then charged towards her. She was frozen with fear, unable to move at all, and he sliced clean through her, but he didn't kill her. Due to her Del Fruit, if she was sliced without the use of Haki, she could regenerate, and Zoro didn't use Haki on purpose, to show her how easily he could kill her, which had a much greater effect than just killing her ever would have, as the trauma from knowing her life was only spared on a whim made her lose control of her body, unable to attack him again. Zoro was like a different character compared to 2 years before. He filled into his shoes of being a top swordsman in the world, and carried himself accordingly, treating those weaker than him as Mihawk would. No doubt his teachings and beliefs rubbed off on Zoro. After that, they made their way to Dressrosa, a rather uneventful arc for Zoro as he spent most of it lost, but in the end, he did have a chance to show off his immense strength in a whole different way, a more direct and clear way, by simply slicing through the biggest opponent possible, one that was the size of a mountain. But the next island they went to was special to Zoro, whether he knew it or not, his ancestral homeland, Wano. He took up the name Zoro Juro as Kinemon asked the Strawhats to disguise themselves and lay low, take up jobs around the capital, but Zoro wasn't interested in that, so instead became a Ronin, and was soon framed for a few murders and brought in for trial. He sat before the magistrate, and they accused him not only of the killings but of grave robbing Ryuma for his sword. He was then handed a knife to commit seppuku, a ritual in where a person guilty of a crime can take their own life instead of having to be executed, to be seen as dying an honorable death. Zoro understood, and said farewell. But he wasn't talking about himself. He turned that tiny knife on the magistrate and said he smelled blood on him, and that he was the one who committed the murders. Then, from all the way across from him, defeated him with one slash. This is a parallel to Mihawk using that tiny knife all the way back in the Baratie, alongside the numerous occasions of Zoro slicing through things like Mihawk did Don Krieg's ship, most recently and obviously slicing through the ship at Sabayori. These are some nice touches to build up similarities between the two future rivals, and also clearly showing one-to-one proof of Zoro creeping closer and closer to the level of Mihawk we were shown at the very start. Zoro apologized to Kinemon, as he now made a huge fuss and would have the eyes of the whole country on him when he was supposed to lay low. He then ran to Gyukimaru, who had taken Shisui. The sword was a national treasure before it was stolen, and it was of utmost importance to the people of Wano that it returned to the country. But Zoro had gotten attached to it, and had fought fairly for it. Even the spirit of Ryuma said it was rightfully his, so he fought Gyukimaru to get it back, but was interrupted by Kamizo, the disguise of Killer, Captain Kid's second in command. He was being attacked from 2 different angles, and as a result, Killer stabbed him, but Zoro only smiled, refusing to let Killer take his blade out of him. He swung to get him away, then took the scythe out himself, and once again had 3 blades, and from there, it only took 1 attack for him to finish Killer. But he passed out from his injuries, and lost his chance to get Shisui back. But when one door closes, another one opens, and he met Hiyori, who gave him an alternative. Enma, the sword once used by Kozuki Oden, and he was the only man to ever tame it. Zoro was told to test it out, and when he was only meant to cut down a single tree, with 1 slash, the sword cut through an entire cliffside, and Zoro's arm shrunk down. The sword was draining Zoro's haki and energy rapidly, and he had to constantly pump more into it just to be able to use it. Everyone warned him against using the sword for this reason. It could be as much of a burden as a benefit, and could harm you during a fight if you weren't careful. But Zoro said no, he'd take it, saying that if he was able to master it, he would be many times stronger, and that was what Zoro liked. He wasn't afraid of hard work or seemingly impossible challenges. No, what really would terrify him is not seeing any way for him to get stronger and grow, but if there was a way for him to advance, he was more than happy to jump headfirst into it. He started training with Enma and got used to it somewhat, and he was told that his treasured sword, the Wado Ichimonji, was made by the same man that made Enma. But Zoro didn't have much time to train, and was forced to put his control of Enma to the test just a few days later, because it was time for them to invade Onigashima, and fight a full Emperor's crew for the first time. They made it to the rooftop, and he saw Luffy knock down Kaido, and he smiled, seeing how far they came. He later blocked a combined attack from the 2 Emperors from hitting Luffy, allowing him to barely get out of the way. Then, he left his captain to fight Kaido one-on-one, fully believing in him to take down the challenge in front of him. But Zoro had his own. This was his biggest test since Mihawk. He was tasked with taking on Kaido's vice captain, the mysterious King. They clashed, and Zoro noticed there were flames and wings on his back, regardless of whether he was in his lLffy transformation or not, and thought he must have been part of a race he didn't know about. King launched him back, and Zoro thought he could only win if he found out what King was. As he was getting tired, Enma took control, and drained the haki out of his arm. He was able to regain control, but Enma still threatened to take over at any moment, and this was the risk in using the sword. King took the chance to charge forward, but stopped right in front of Zoro. He stabbed King, but he exploded. Zoro was barely able to survive, covering himself with haki at the last second. He then attacked again, but it did no damage to King. Zoro was surprised that one of his strongest attacks did nothing, and after using so much energy on it, Enma drained his haki again, and he couldn't protect himself from King's counterattack. King knocked Wado Ichimonji away from him, and while picking it up, it made him realize something. How did a sword crafted by the same man who made Enma end up in the East Blue? He thought back to his childhood, and remembered. The man who sat by the cliff, that gave him his first 2 swords, was the one who crafted Enma. And after recalling all the lessons the old man preached about swords choosing their masters, Zoro realized, throughout this fight, Enma was testing him, seeing if he was worthy to fill Kozuki Oden's shoes. That man was able to wield Enma, even while it drained this much haki out of him. So if Zoro wanted to measure up, he'd have to adapt, and become strong enough to be worthy of this sword. But Zoro thought that was impossible. He'd die if he just kept pouring in more haki. But no, at that moment, Enma brought something out of him. As it drained his haki, it also caused another form of haki to leak out, Conqueror's haki, the manifestation of Zoro's dreams and ambition. He remembered his promises to Luffy and Kuina, and smiled. He started fighting King again, reinvigorated, and was able to figure out the rules of King's body. When the flames on his back were out, he got faster, but also got weaker, and that was the time to strike. He was now able to damage King, but it wasn't going to be easy to do so. This was still the right-hand man of an emperor, and King proved it by launching Zoro through the building. Zoro said that he didn't have much time. If he dragged it on, Enma would kill him, and he said now it was the Strawhat's time to be on top. Zoro slashed him, but as expected it didn't do anything as the flames were still on. King countered, unleashing fire as hot as magma. They disengaged, and Zoro felt King getting faster, so knew his defenses were down, and caught him with the perfect strike, slicing him right down the middle. Zoro kept the pressure up and taunted King, saying he was blocking even while his flames were up, scared that Zoro had the potential to damage him even in that state. But King kept up the bravado, saying he'd remember Zoro as a decent swordsman, but Zoro replied that if he survived, he'd be scarred so bad that he'd never forget. King intended to finish it, going in with his final attack, but Zoro ran headfirst into it, and sliced through it all, finishing him with one perfect attack, even while his flames were still on, leaving no doubt who was stronger. It was now the Straw Hats era, and Luffy proved it by taking down Kaido, just as Zoro knew he would. Luffy was named as one of the emperors, and now they were cemented, and the entire crew were closer to their dreams than ever before. They headed towards the island of the future, Egghead, and there he met his old rival, Kaku. But now, even though both had gotten stronger, Zoro had widened the gap between them even more, but their fight got interrupted, and Zoro had a new challenge in front of him, S-Hawk, a pacifista modeled after Mihawk. Zoro went into clash with him and tested if he was really similar to the man he was modeled after, but Zoro said he wasn't, that even the Seraphim was more human than Mihawk was. Zoro might have seen something in those 2 years, because it doesn't seem like Zoro was only referring to Mihawk being inhumanly strong, but something else as well. Zoro later discovered that S-Hawk had the Dice fruit as well, or at least a recreation of it, and on top of that had the same properties as King. This pacifista was a combination of 3 of Zoro's previous opponents, and alongside fighting Kaku only minutes earlier, the island of the future was more like the island of the past for Zoro, allowing him to revisit his old rivals. But there wasn't much time for reflection, as he was in constant battle, and his next opponent was actually one of his captains, Rob Lucci. But Zoro said he wasn't strong enough to even be worth Luffy's time anymore, and Lucci doubted him, thinking there was no way Luffy's vice captain could stand up to him, but he was wrong. And with a little extra motivation from Sanji saying Zoro was taking his sweet time with Lucci, Zoro went in for the finishing blow and defeated him. But Zoro's battles weren't done. The 5 elders landed on the island, and while the Straw Hats were trying to make their escape, one of them, Venus Juro, went to attack the crew, and Zoro defended them, clashing evenly with the ancient swordsman. He noticed the elder used the Kitetsu blade, the same kind of sword as the one he got in Logtown, but the energy both of them put into their clash caused them to fly backwards, and Zoro was luckily caught by Jinbei, and they again went to make their escape, but we don't know if they did, as that's all we have at the time of this video. Overall, Zoro is the perfect swordsman. No, he hasn't reached the peak of the One Piece world's strength yet, but his honor, resilience, and loyalty are all outstanding. His word and promises mean everything to him, and he would literally rather die than break them. Whether making a promise to a childhood friend, or even joining a pirate crew, starting a life he never wanted to live, he won't complain. He won't give up when things get too hard. He can be shown how impossible his promise to Kuina was when facing Mihawk, but he picked himself up and wasn't discouraged at all. He could have left the Straw Hats when the crew was in a time of peril with Usopp and Robin leaving. He never wanted to be a pirate after all, but no, he stayed and supported his captain, giving him advice and making him a better captain and man because of it. A flawless example of what a vice captain should be. Zoro has his flaws of course, but he's a better character because of them. Zoro is a reminder to never lose faith in your dreams, always look for ways to improve. Even after getting many times stronger, Zoro is still excited just at the chance to find a way to improve even more. He shows that you should always be humble, willing to learn more, even if it means taking a hit to your pride. And on top of all of that, there are things more important than your greatest dreams, and it's okay to let go of them for a greater reason, as long as you know in your heart of hearts that you've done every single thing you can to achieve them. Zoro teaches us all of these lessons and countless more over 1,000 chapters, and I've tried my best to showcase just a glimpse of his incredible journey here. And if you made it this far, I think we can all agree that we can't wait to see how the greatest swordsman's journey ends.